Hi, it is Sammy again, and I am just thinking about a lot of different things about the intention behind spells, how like magic really works for people. Because, going by Tumblr and just who I've met in real life and just through books, like it seems like we all reach this sort of goal of intention work from different places, kind of depending on our learning styles, what we're interested in, what we even really want to know. And I talked to my roommate, who is also a sort of witchy inclined sort of person, just kind of what she thought. But when I was kind of starting this, I really wanted to think about, because I have all these thoughts when it comes to magic and intention work, and I was thinking, um, how does this, not just how this works for me, but kind of in a framework, like how can other people think about magic and when they're really kind of getting into it, especially if they're new and they're just trying to figure out this whole process, and to kind of guide me because, my thoughts are here, there, everywhere, like, it's, and this is going to be like a really weird reference, but it reminds me of the first episode of SpongeBob SquarePants when he starts the job at the Krabby Patty and all of like the sardines are like trying to get in because there's like a tour bus or something. I'm kind of just like, these are all the thoughts. Um, so to kind of orient myself, I did a simple 3 card spread and I used my little pocket size sort of Rider Waite deck, and I just thought about it as beginning, middle, and end. And when I drew beginning, I got the Four of Cups, and with the Four Cups, the first thing, even though the associations with this cup differ, the thing that came to my mind was manifesting. That sort of something coming from nothing and just having to reach out and grab it, which also brings me back to a kind of 90s tastic reference. If you remember the creme de la creme of Disney Channel original movies, there was one called Halloween Town with a certain um, awesome grand dame of the cinema, Debbie Reynolds, as the grandma, the greatest, and she tells her granddaughter um, that witchcraft is very simple. It's just wanting something and letting yourself have it. And this kind of card, in a lot of ways, is kind of not reaching out and grabbing it. The official keywords are doubt, hesitation, introspection. But thinking about this card, it really reminds me of how what we all kind of go through when we start kind of on this path. It's not just our interests, but kind of what makes us want to do this, and what do we want from this. And I think that's like a really big part of any kind of new witch's journey. And I don't think it really depends on what path you're taking. If you're a Gardnerian Wiccan, if you are very much sort of a pantheist, or whatever eclectic chaos, whatever you're kind of going, what kind of path you're on. I think that that is kind of the big thing in the beginning is the self doubt. Can I do this? Should I do this? The kind of hesitation, and sort of like the introspection. That I think that that's a point that all the books kind of mention, and when you talk to people who have kind of been on this journey longer, that's a big thing that they emphasize more than knowing correspondences, no more than like bonding with a matron or patron. It's sort of that introspection, and that kind of corresponds with when I was talking to my roommate about, what her challenges are with witchcraft. One of the big things that was a challenge was the idea of, am I doing this right? And, finding what feels right. And I had the same sort of journey where I was like, is this something that where am I going to find my path on this? So that kind of makes me think about, and that's kind of like if you take that sort of cycle of, like, I guess, a witchy understanding, in some ways it's not too dissimilar to when you are kind of creating a spell and thinking about it, because you do have those, at least you should be able to, like, interrogate why you want something, especially if your spell has an effect on another person. You should really think about, why do I want this? Is there a more tangible, sort of practical, in meat space thing that I can do to further this goal with this person? And of course, for yourself. Um, so that was the beginning. And the middle that I got was the uh, Seven of Pentacles. And he's a jolly old medieval chap just looking over his grand harvest of pentacles. I mean, you know, looking over that achievement. And for me, that kind of like showed the tangible, because that's kind of the pentacles. It's the material, it's what you do. And I think that's also an important part of spellcraft as well. At least for me, when I do a spell, when I do any sort of enchantment, incantation, whenever I'm trying to affect energy, my placement perception, I always try to think, what is a tangible thing that I can do to further this goal? Because if I am going to, you know, um, invoke my matron, if I am going to, put together like an herb mix, or if I'm going to go to the work of doing this spell, then I really need to think, what is a tangible thing that I can do to further this goal? Because for me, when I ask something from the universe, I also want to show that I am a able partner in this. I am committed. I'm not just saying gimme, gimme, gimme. You know, to paraphrase a lovely song by ABBA, I must sound like the oldest like soccer mom or something, but I swear to God, I'm 28. I don't know. My brain picks and chooses things. But yes, so the midpoint is the Seven of Pentacles. And one thing to think about is, and this just kind of makes me think of my conversation with my roommate, is, she was talking about how do I incorporate more magic and intention in, everyday life. And I think this is something that a lot of us struggle with. I know that I do, because I do want to have a component um, of that sort of perception shifting, head changing, um, intention work in my life. So I have that touchstone. And it made me think about how my roommate has a passion planner, and thinking about how even just making a list, planning out your day, those are almost, that's something that you could almost make into something a little bit more witchy than you think. You're like, oh well, you're just kind of, using stationery or office supplies, add some sigils, use color correspondences, or just use that to kind of like solidify your intentions. Maybe in your planner, you might find the beginnings of, something that you could do a spell for, something where you could incorporate, a moon cycle or something into your practice. Oh, and I forgot to mention that, when I was talking about the Pentacles, the Seven of Pentacles, for the midpoint, is that I had a very full day of doing work and then family and stuff like that. So I knew I wanted to do something creative, but when you get done with like the day and you come home and you can relax and you're like, okay, I can do things, or I can go down into a Reddit slash Pinterest slash Tumblr slash social media du jour hole and just turn into a bit of a zombie with my phone for the rest of the evening. And I felt myself very much in danger of doing that. That's why at like 11 at night I'm making this video, because I did not want to not do anything, because I felt drawn to, create something or work with my witchiness. That's kind of how I combine the two. So you might notice that there is a purple candle in my little cauldron. I really like the color purple because, associating with creativity, I always have. Um, so I anointed this with sort of a cleansing oil that I've made, and then I also rubbed that oil with this sea salt, or that I charged under the last meteor shower for the Pleiades. And then I added a selection of my favorite stones: selenite, citrine, bloodstone, goldstone, just to kind of give that sort of psychological key, that witchiness, that intention, that sending it out in the inner universe, that blending of tangible, I'm going to do this, with intangible, I'm getting my like brain and subconscious on board. That's sometimes when I think about spell work, I think about how do I take intentions in hands and bring them closer together, unite them. And that's something to also think about when you're making these spells. Or you're just doing any sort of work that has intention, or magic, or witchcraft, or spirituality. Whenever you're sending those desires, it doesn't matter if it's like, a Wiccan ritual, or if you're doing the secret and making a vision board. It's a giant red solo cup. Um, One of my part time job is with a European company, and they asked me about that when I traveled over to see, just to do a company thing. And they asked me about the red solo cup, and I was like, no, this isn't. We don't all have these. This isn't. That's just a stereotype. And then I come home and I realize I have a giant novelty red solo cup. Oops. I guess really, that is a stereotype that some of us certainly are guilty of, and I am one of them. Um, and then the last one is something that I kind of alluded to in the. Um, oh, I forgot to mention that the keywords for Seven of Pentacles is evaluation. It's fruits of labor. It's assessment. And I think that's also something to think about whenever you do a spell, is to just kind of check back with yourself. Did this kind of go your way? Did you feel like, okay, I accomplished something? Did it help you? Did it unlock, you know, the key in your brain? Did it send some synapses firing? Did it change your vibration? Did you see any effects? You know? And that's the thing throughout all these cards, and I think throughout the whole process of witchcraft and spell work, is something that's really brought home with the card that I got for ending, the Hermit. The one who is seeking introspection, reflection, using something like a book of mirrors. You can also call it a journal, a diary, a log, whatever. It can just be even something that you just think about. If you can be someone who can kind of capture that in your brain, do it. Use your fantastical brain powers to do that. But just, the part of spell work that I've noticed in witchcraft is that a lot of it is very much mental. The stuff where we're using herbs, where we're using charms, candles, these, this is almost like the tip of the iceberg. When you're doing this work, so much is done just psychologically in your head before and after. That it's something that, is such a big part of it. The keywords for the Hermit is like discretion, detachment, withdrawal, seeking wisdom. And there is an aspect of that that you can take how you need to. Maybe for you, taking a walk in the forest or the desert or whatever beautiful climate that you're in, is something that you need to do to withdraw. Maybe you go into your room and you meditate, or you do yoga, something like that. Even if you just, maybe just kind of like journal on the bus, buy a bus ticket and go around and kind of reflect on the people, write for signs, things like that, synchronicity, serendipity. You can do that. And I don't think it's like really like so much detachment, for me in spell work, from you know, like, you know how some people say after you do a spell, just kind of like walk away from it, give yourself time. Like, that's valid and that's really important. But I think that you do need to like go back, especially when you learn, because that was one thing that when I was talking to my roommate that came up for us a lot is that this all takes time and focus, and it also takes, it's not just time where, okay, I have to like give myself X amount of minutes or hours to do this ritual or spell. Kind of like I need to take the time to learn, not just the classic year and a day, but really like, you know, give myself some time to study, give myself, some time to figure out what works for me. Like, since both me and my roomie are, very like writing oriented, that's something that comes up a lot in our spell work and our intention work and our witchcraft. You know, but we differ in some ways. Where for my friend, since she is such like she's a trained singer, music is really important to her, on a level where since I'm not a musician, like I like music, but it's not something where I have training to understand tones and read music and, go that in depth. For her, sound can be a big part of how she centers herself, how she sends out this intention, how she meditates, things like that. So when you do this sort of work, you're not just like looking for the best practices, if you will, even though in the end the best practice is the one that you actually do. It's not just finding the best practice that, everybody like reblogs or that people are tweeting. The best practice is the one that you do and that really fits your style. Because if you're somebody who is very much like a visual person, and you're somebody that maybe you wouldn't connect to a spell if you're like, writing a poem or you're writing something on a bay leaf or you're doing something like that. Maybe when you do this sort of work, you need to get into like not like specifically like vision board territory, but maybe you need to think about how do you use visuals, how do you use creativity, and how do you work that into what you do. And that could be something where it's not even just like um, your learning style, it's not just like your thinking style, or like your physical talents. You could also think about hobbies. Like if you're somebody who knits, like, I've got into knitting, and one thing that I do is that, sometimes when I'm working on a piece and it kind of takes a theme, like I have one since I've been on sort of like a self love kind of healing journey, introspection, that kind of thing. I've been knitting this sweater, or this scarf, I mean, and it's something that, subconsciously and consciously I've been weaving in this sort of journey, like sort of pouring whatever, like, not like negativity, but just sort of like when you get done with something that may be stressful or traumatic, you have that excess, just like that emotional bad taste in your mouth. It might have been something that was a learning experience. It might have been something that maybe was inevitable, but it was still something that emotionally you feel. Knitting that into this scarf kind of makes me feel like maybe I should cleanse it and donate it, not give it as a gift to somebody. But you can work those sort of things into your practice. Like my roomie is all about palmistry. That's like a body part that she's always thought is interesting. When I do divination, I don't know what it was, but even though I'm not like an intensely visual person, tarot cards, that's where it is for me. And the thing is that it is difficult. One thing I like to do when I do a tarot reading is that I like to look at the underside of the deck. And that's sort of like the shadow element, what's underneath. And that one was the Seven of Wands. As you can see, you can kind of guess, like with most of the Rider Waite, you can kind of guess what the keywords are. Defiance, purpose, gaining advantage, and that's something. And there's a struggle aspect. You can tell that this is not easy. This guy might have higher ground, but he is working the fuck out of that wand. Like he is like going like Little John on these mofos. And that's something to think about where this sort of discovery of yourself and your, because that's kind of in a lot of ways where, witchcraft for me is most helpful. And I've noticed that as a theme for people when I talk to them in, real life, online, videos that I've seen, is that witchcraft has been really helpful for people because it's helped them discover more about themselves that they didn't know before. Or just like given them acceptance, into this place. But it's not easy. You have to really, that undercurrent of introspection, evaluation, assessment, seeking wisdom is going to be an undercurrent into all of this. And that's something that when people are looking for spells, that's what we all kind of gravitate towards at first. It's like, you know, give me the goods. I wanna do some shit. Um, and it's not a bad way to approach it. Because I feel like as long as you're not mucking around in like closed sort of religion or witchcraft traditions, that you don't have an understanding of the tools or the energies or the powers or, even stuff like the herbs that you're working with, maybe you don't know how to prepare them. Maybe it's like a potion that you're supposed to drink and you need a specialized knowledge to use this, or you're using substitutions or something like that. It could be, as mundane or magical as you want, you know, just those aren't places to try your training wheels for sure. And when you are kind of not thinking about the impact that you may have, when you're starting out, you know, I think that it doesn't, I think that you always learn which with each action and which each, spell or with each book or with whatever you're doing, you're always learning. So I'm not somebody that says, "Oh, you have to, spend a year and a day in intense study, filling out a book of shadows, following the wheel of the seasons, joining or being initiated into a coven before you can even, write love or prosperity on a bay leaf or something, you know, go to it, but understand that, there is that deeper level that makes this intention that you're setting out, it makes it more potent when you kind of delve deeper. And it's something that maybe it doesn't have the same, you know, I guess, gratification of, making a sigil about an ex and burning it. Maybe it doesn't have the same, if you're, you know, whatever you're going for. I'm not saying that when you're making like um, a bath salt mix or something that you really got to spend like 2 weeks being like, this is why I want to add eucalyptus, and this is why I want to have my aura cleansed, and yada yada yada. Like, I'm not saying that you have to delve deeply every time put a crystal necklace on, but we all know the bigger rituals, the bigger spells that we're doing, the things that we can feel the emotional intensity with, and how to proceed accordingly. So that's something, of course, I am not a expert on the subject. Maybe I should have started off with that disclaimer, but obviously, since you haven't seen my name in a bookstore, um, and I don't have, a a well-known name or something, you probably already figured that I'm just like a random Jane off the street giving you my opinion, and you're gonna use whatever grain of salt you feel is most appropriate. Go ahead. But I know that for me, it's always been helpful to kind of hear what the just kind of like run of the mill, average, everyday sort of practitioner, which whatever is kind of doing and how they're thinking about this. Because I feel like the books do give an explanation, but neither of us are Raymond Buckland. You know what I'm saying? We don't write like, we really want to be included into broken or something. So it's always kind of helpful, at least for me, and I'm hoping for you, to kind of think about, how other people do this and what sort of intentions that they put into their work and why do spells work. That's something that I've always found very interesting. Don't mind me, I was putting a little bit more of a mix onto my little charcoal that I have going on. Um, because for me, magic spells, these all work because not only are we're kind of going through what psychologists call, you know, I forget what it's called, but I know that it's sort of like a wheel of how you figure out like a goal or a plan or your ability to change or what you're trying to do. So it kind of starts off with that pre contemplation, you know, or before that, where you don't even know you have a problem, and then kind of pre contemplation, you kind of like have this like sinking feeling something's not right. Then you have contemplation, where you're outright thinking of things, and then you kind of go on from there. Um, and I think when you do any sort of intention work, that you're going through those stages. And you're going through those stages in a way where the best spells are you're doing something tangible and you're also doing something intangible, where you're keeping your hands busy, but you're also satisfying the different parts of your brain, especially, your subconscious, what, in this one meditation video I heard somebody call the monkey brain, which is kind of like a dismissive term, but I feel like you know, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but that sort of part of your brain that really needs you to like use symbolism, to use intention, to give it something to kind of hold on to as like a driving force, because as we all know, willpower, motivation, that can be a finite resource. It's a renewable resource, but it is finite, so you kind of have to do things that not just replenish your well, but also give you a head change. How do you get out of, Susie Q during the workday, and Susie Q, going under like her craft name, and just like getting shit done in the astral, or how you send that intention or how you work this. You're going through those different stages in a sense when you're doing spell work, when you're doing intention work, even when, like, for me, since a lot of my practice is very, personal, it's very much dependent on me and affecting me. I'm not as interested in having an external effect on others. I've never, really wanted to like get a bag of witchgrass and just like kind of have effect on another person. It's not where I'm at the moment. Um, so a lot of times, I have found myself making sacred space, setting up, sort of what some people might think would be a ritual or a spell, simply just to get into a mindset where I can be in that sacred space and do shadow work, so I can journal, so I can really use my book of mirrors, to really get in depth. And sometimes I found doing that is almost as good as doing a spell. I might like light a candle, I might hold a crystal, I might, you know, use a special incense blend, but primarily I'm working in my head, and writing is such a big component of that. Your mileage is going to vary, but that's the thing. When you do spells, I feel like, sometimes it can feel like that sort of, work can be very much pigeonholed, into sort of like, okay, you take 1/4 rosemary, and you take, a fresh bay leaf, and you take, ground parsley, and et cetera, light of the waning moon, go to a crossroads, what have you. And for me, don't get me wrong, I I need that sometimes. If I have the time, and I am in the space where I'm like, yes, I need to make a definitive sort of statement to my brain, to the universe, to get this thing out. I can do like a ritual or like a thing that goes from my like altar here, in my bedroom, to out in the garden, to a crossroads, to whatever. It can be like, my longest was like 2 hours of like intense journal work, making offerings to my matron and patron, meditating in my little garden area where I have my little outside, shrine altar area, because I really wanted to get to that place, to make that statement to myself. There are some days when, I am good to go if I just, hold on to and charge, and program, a crystal necklace that I'm wearing, and I do a tarot draw that day. Those aren't necessarily traditional spells, but I think when people really want to put magic into their day, those kind of little things can kind of add up. They're almost like, you know, mini spells or whatever. I mean, people are doing spell emojis. So honestly, there's such a wide diversity in like what is a spell, how people do intention work, that really I think you can have a really good time and figure out what is firing up the synapses in your brain, what's unlocking keys, and you can really have a good time with that. Um, so I think in this video on my thoughts on spells, this is kind of how that turned out. My lovely little Rider Waite sort of plot line. I think that went reasonably well. Um, I don't know about you. I actually did the video, so I feel like, you know, I did my spell. And then I actually did what I asked the universe for. I set myself up and then I did it. Um, and hopefully with this, since I didn't have any technical errors, I got all the creativity that I wanted, because there has been times when I've sat down to a computer, whether it is recording something, or it is writing something, or it is creating something in Photoshop. I've had that moment of being like, fizzle, 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 squirrel, 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 Benny Hill theme, being like, wow, I got nothing, more nothing, you know. So I'm very grateful to the universe. I'm very grateful to my matron and patron. I'm grateful to myself and to my tools and to all those energies, But I think that at the end of the day, when you're doing spells, that you really got to think about, you know, um, kind of maybe a process of manifesting the tangible and then introspection on what you did. I feel like you can really have like an infinite variety of components, but if you kind of keep to, thinking about your intent, I guess manifestation would be better as intent. So let's scratch that. So, you know, intention of what you want to manifest, doing something tangible, and introspection. I feel like no matter what kind of spell, intention work, enchantment, ritual, whatever you're doing, if you start with that as kind of like your plot outline, if you will, then it almost like whatever you need to slot into place to flip that switch, to turn your perception, to get you that head change, it almost whatever, you're going to have that as your foundation, and you're really going to see that you're going to actually kind of achieve what you're going for, whatever result you're going to get there, and don't be afraid to riff. I think that's something that, as I've gone into this video, you kind of already noticed that, like, I play fast and loose. I have, of course, some things that are sacred, that are not mine, that I leave alone, but I do kind of play around with what affects me, what resonates, and what I'm going to go with, and I would really encourage for folks who have kind of, been on this path for a while, you probably are like, yes, it's good, that, but it's something that for me, just like with my roommate, that was a big struggle for me is, am I doing this right? and does this feel right? And that's why I went through study, not like initiation, but just like study, observation, talking to people, maybe going to public rituals, and just kind of figure out what path I want for me. That's very eclectic. But for you it might be different. But don't be afraid to try to figure out what resonates for you when you're making a spell, because I guarantee that you will see your results, your motivation, your efficiency, whatever you're going for in this, it will increase because it's personal and because it's for you. Don't feel like you have to be hemmed in when you're doing this work because your workstation doesn't look like what you see on Instagram, because you don't have the ingredients that people want, or if you're not drawn to the rituals and to the spells that you see. It's like when you're cooking. Yeah, if you want the exact thing, you're gonna follow a recipe. But honestly, most of us just kind of riff off it. And I think that spells, witchcraft, that's not very different. Because when all our, like, I guess, witch grandmothers, and grandfathers, and I guess grand NBs were, going out back in the day, they certainly didn't have, all the supplies at hand. They didn't have the books at hand. They might have had some oral traditions, but they were playing it by ear and they were going with what they had and what worked for them. So I would say draw upon your witch grandmothers and forefathers to really just harness that kind of like play as you go sort of attitude with this. Anyway, I guess I have talked to you long enough about spells, and I hope that you enjoyed this talk. And just, I really want to kind of get a dialogue back and forth, because one thing that we both agreed on is that, it's this sort of work just feels like it goes faster when, or like at least you get more perspectives and you kind of get, a more holistic approach is when you can create a dialogue. So if you are interested in any part of this, please comment, and just let me know, how do you do spells? How do they work for you? Hit me up. Let me know. Thanks.